everybody. Welcome back. I'm Susan Linder, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. And I am just thrilled because it's an honor to have members of the military on this show. I want to make a disclaimer before I dive in and introduce you to my guest that he is not speaking on behalf of the DoD, the Department of Defense here in the United States. He is speaking as an author, as a leader, as an executive trainer, and as someone who brings a very unique perspective to the topic of innovation and storytelling. So without further ado, I would love to introduce you to Miles Garrett. Miles is the product of Kansas Public Schools, the United States Marine Corps, and the U.S. Navy. He is a graduate of the University of Kansas, the Marine Corps Infantry School, Cornell University, the Naval Nuclear Power School, and the Submarine Command Course. He is a working product of the Naval Postgraduate School, the Hoffman Academy, and the United States Submarine Force. He has touched all longitudes and all northern latitudes. He is also the son of his mother and father, a brother, husband, and father of his own. He is a product of the United States. And in addition to that, he is coming to us with a perspective that I find truly unique that we can share on this conversation here at Innovation Storytellers. He is also the author of Executive Leadership, a Warfighter's Perspective, and he writes on many topics, including geostrategy, parenting, social justice, and cinema. His expertise lies at the intersection of nuclear power, organizational networking, leadership development, and his overarching focus on justice and democracy. And there could not be a more appropriate time to dive into these topics. So, Miles, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, this is my pleasure. Thank you so much, Susan.
So today is February 24th. We are getting into spring. We are coming out of what feels like a very long 4 weeks or 6 weeks of winter, I think, since the beginning of the year. And what do you have to say about today's date, Miles?
I love that question. I'm a big fan of considering days in history. This is February 24th, and on this day in history, in 1812, Napoleon I of France and Frederick William III of Prussia formed a Franco-Prussian alliance by signing the 1812 Treaty of Paris.
And what was the consequence of that treaty?
The consequences live on to this day. You consider the timing of it, right? We're talking Napoleon I, so the Napoleonic Wars, which have been going on for a long time by then. Also, the U.S. and Britain are engaged in the War of 1812, right, where Britain came and burned down the White House in Washington. It was a time of international turmoil, and that was an alliance, as I understand it, to either guard against or attack Russia. I don't honestly, I need to study more about that period of history. I was doing some research on this, as I do most days, on what was this day in history, and I came across that, and it kind of piqued my interest. One, because of because of its international significance, which I'm sure continues today, and two, because I don't know much about it. So I would love to study that myself.
Good. So you are in the you are in the Navy. You are an executive thought leader. Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write this book.
So absolutely. I came to the title as my position of executive officer on a nuclear powered submarine, USS Cheyenne, which is based here out of Portsmouth Naval Shipyard
In New Hampshire.
Actually, that's a Supreme Court case right now. Technically it's in Maine, but New Hampshire
Okay.
disagrees, and they're trying to get it to be New Hampshire. It's right on the border between the two. So I kind of have 1 foot in Maine and 1 foot in New Hampshire.
Got it.
I was not thinking of writing a book. I wrote it about 5 months after showing up as executive officer. I had a close friend and colleague say, "Hey, you should start giving some leadership talks," because I was kind of lamenting how leadership was not an everyday conversation in my organization. And to me, that was a problem. And I mentioned that to him, and he said, "Hey, well, you should just start giving some leadership talks." And within a couple of days, I gave my first one. And the main body of the book is comprised of near verbatim copies of those talks.
Wow. And so that lack of discussion around leadership, what do you think the consequences of that are when you're not having a regular discussion on leadership? Or what were you see happening that you thought it was so critical?
Well, honestly, I think that's a problem throughout the Navy and throughout most organizations. The organization that I've been part of that has done it the best is the United States Marine Corps. The United States Marine Corps starts in day one of boot camp, instilling the principles of leadership, and they continue it on a daily basis to where, most importantly, peers talk with each other about leadership. Peer feedback is the most long lasting and most important.
Hmm. And what does that conversation sound like if you're newly entering into the Marine Corps? So many of us don't have that experience of being in the military. What does a conversation around leadership for people just entering the Marine Corps look like?
Yeah, I mean, it starts from a position of humility, and it can be trivial kind of stuff, like a minor thing on somebody's uniform. Like if my ribbon badge right here, I don't know if you can see that, but if that was crooked, people would not hesitate to point that out. And they're usually, sometimes you
Mhm.
can be a jerk about it, but usually people aren't jerks about it. It's just hey, that's that's not right. Fix yourself. But if you can just imagine extending that to basically all of our behavior, they do a very good job of communicating organizational priorities among themselves and discussing them and considering the implications.
Yeah, and so the implication of not having something small like that correct has larger implications on the battlefield or in communication or something else. Is that the idea?
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of discipline, and Marine Corps boot camp is expert at teaching somebody individual discipline, but my career has taught me how to instill organizational discipline. Because really, that's what like if you think of NASA from 1961 to 1969, can you imagine the discipline involved in all those thousands of people, from mechanics turning wrenches to the engineers to the management, the leaders, like the whole entire organization had this discipline that allowed it to happen, it being the landing on the moon and the safe return of all three passengers in 8 years. That's a remarkable level of discipline. And like, here's my thing to the listener. Have you ever studied the United States just before World War II? The United States just before World War II was like a sleeping giant. Right? Our gross domestic output paled in comparison to our potential. And it was because people were just kind of going through the motions, dragging their feet, looking for extrinsic motivation, being resentful about whatever their conditions were. And as a result, we had significantly less societal wealth than would otherwise be the case. Now, when Pearl Harbor happened, the nation woke up just like waking up a sleeping giant, and our gross national output skyrocketed, and we contributed to Allied victory as a result. I submit to you that it should not take a national crisis to do that. And we would all benefit. And if we did that, we would all work less work hours and be more satisfied.
Hmm. Well, I mean, historically, there were a couple of things going on, right? I mean, we certainly had World War One, and if its after effects in the 20s, we had the boom and bust of the stock market crash. We were plunged into a national depression, and the Dust Bowl that consumed so much of our agricultural income, which was the bulk of the United States economy at that time. So there were other historical precedents, right, that were going on prior where we weren't a happy ship necessarily at the time before all that happened. Do you think?
Oh, I completely agree. I
Yeah,
completely agree. And I'm glad you brought up the Dust Bowl because that was in my mind. I grew up in Kansas, and the Dust Bowl was real in Kansas. And
that's right.
I've heard firsthand accounts about what it was like. Yeah, absolutely. There are certainly lots of conditions that fed into the state of things of how they were then, just like there are now. There are lots of conditions right now that feed into why we are where we are. But I submit that we don't have to wait for a crisis to make them better.
Yeah, I would hope so, right? And we've had some pretty incredible periods of prosperity in our
Yes.
time too. And do you attribute that prosperity to discipline? What do you attribute that to?
There's one of my probably top three favorite authors was a naval officer named Alfred Thayer Mahan. He heavily influenced Theodore Roosevelt, and he had, I apologize, I don't have this in front of me, so I'm not going to get this exactly correct, but he had something like six conditions that factor into a nation's naval strength and therefore its wealth. And those include a nation's geographical position and the extent of its territory. So if you consider the United States, we are protected on both sides by oceans, and we have largely peaceful neighbors to the north and south.
Hmm.
We have extent of territory, we have access to natural resources. And then two of the other conditions are the character of the people, and the character of the American people is remarkably great, and the character of the government, right? And that involves things like how entrepreneurial can the government be, and how entrepreneurial are there? It's no accident that things like the internet and touchscreen technology and satellites and the list goes on and on. It's no accident that those came from us, and that's because of the character of our government.
And the laws that we decide to pass, right? That allow commerce to take place and allow capital to be shared, etc.
Yep, 100%. It's all rooted in the Constitution and the laws of the United States. 100%.
So when you think about discipline, I would say not one of my top four traits for sure. But I'm curious, tell me a little bit more about executive leadership and where do you think we can learn potentially from the military? Because we've had a lot of command and control based management systems in corporations for many, many years. That that line of thinking around schools of management seems to have faded from glory as fewer and fewer members of the corporate workforce are actually military members or past military members.
Yeah.
Do you advocate for that kind of executive leadership structure?
I think maybe the word discipline is a little misleading. It
Mm.
probably has a bad connotation in certain circles, and I'm not really interested in debating that. I mean, if it has a bad connotation, let's use the word focus, right?
Okay.
What I'm talking about is getting a team of people to focus on large and challenging objectives.
Mm.
And yes, that's absolutely needed in businesses. The business, the literature on leadership it overlaps to a large extent between the military and business. And there's a reason for that. It's because we're studying the same stuff and we're trying to practice the same stuff. We're just coming at it from two different perspectives.
So tell us, what is your vision then around executive leadership? What should leaders be considering now that perhaps they haven't?
They teach in business schools that when you promulgate the values for your organization, that you should limit those to between 3 and 5. Because if I give you a list of 30 values, throw in something like focus or integrity, I could give you a list of 30 if I had the time to kind of put that together. Chances are very high that you would agree with all 30 of them. But if you're in a leadership position and you try to emphasize all 30, it just confuses the team. So you need to narrow it down to 3 to 5 that you emphasize and allow your team to focus on. My book is an example of that. I spent the first 4 to 5 months of my job as executive officer learning the crew and figuring out where their strengths were and where their weaknesses were. And kind of the culminating factor in that was that in the military, we do these annual morale surveys where the crew gets to offer their direct input on a whole host of questions. And they have ample leeway to put whatever they want. Sometimes there's vulgarity in there, but every single comment I take seriously. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to end up agreeing with it. And I don't always act on it, but there's something of value in every single comment, even if it leaves stuff out. Like if it's so lacking that it just leaves a whole bunch out, then you have to read between like, okay, what's this person trying to leave out and why are they leaving that out? So once I learned the crew, I was able to narrow down the values that I needed to promulgate for the crew to a list of three. And those three are what the book focuses on.
And do you want to share those with us?
Oh, absolutely. So intrinsic motivation, professional trust, and the pursuit of excellence. And the thing is, like, if you want to take any one of those and learn about them, then my book's not really the best resource for it. The best resource for intrinsic motivation is a book published in the 90s by a man named Alfie Kohn. It's not even strictly a leadership book, but it's called Punished by Rewards. And it's on the dangers inherent in extrinsic motivation and how that undermines what we're all really searching to develop in our people and in ourselves, which is intrinsic motivation. And then professional trust, the best source for that I've come across is Stephen Covey's The Speed of Trust.
Well, let's talk about intrinsic motivation for a moment. What is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation? How do you define those?
Extrinsic motivation is looking for the rewards. Actually, it also includes punishment, right? So that's things like promotions, congratulations, rounds of applause, punishment. We have a thing in the military called NJP. So if somebody violates the Uniform Code of Military Justice, then they're punished for it. That's all extrinsic stuff. Like, why should I not commit a crime? Well, because I'll be punished for it, which really is the wrong way of thinking, right? You shouldn't commit a crime because you should intrinsically feel the need to uphold society's values.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing. I'll cite another example for you. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Distance education. There are like, I don't know, I could come up with somewhere between 5 and 10 universities that military members often choose to go to get essentially a free education on the government's dime, right? It's a great thing that the government does to kind of pay military service members back for all the sacrifices that they make and all the time away from their family. The thing with those is that if you choose to go to one of those places and you're just looking for the degree is the extrinsic motivator. So you're very likely to do the minimum amount of work, enter in the minimum number of comments possible, submit the assignments as required, but don't really learn anything from it, and then get the degree. And if you go that route, that's what you'll get out of it. You'll get a degree and very little else. But embedded within the curriculum of all those places is the same education that you can get anywhere else. So if you go into it with the intrinsic motivation of, I'm going to learn the curriculum through and through, you'll get that, and you'll get it free.
Yeah. So that intrinsic motivation is, and so how does one find the interior personal drive rather than waiting for the external?
That's a lot of mentorship from others. I've personally gotten it from a lot of reading. Leadership coaching can be very effective at that. My book is an example of how I actively taught that. Because like part of it is just knowledge, right? Part of it is laying it out there of, look, motivation can be either intrinsic or extrinsic. Here are the dangers of extrinsic motivation. And here's what we're all trying to get to is intrinsic motivation. And now I would like to point out though, that like, at least as things are right now, we should not avoid extrinsic motivation. That is very necessary in the short term just to advance people's careers, right? Because it's expected throughout at least my line of business, which is fine. Like, I don't object to the extrinsic motivation itself, I don't object to the extrinsic reward. What I object to is it being the motivating factor for people's behavior.
Right. So let's move on to that next quality then, because it's important that we get to these. So professional trust is not an everyday occurrence, right? A leader is responsible for building that trust within their team. How do you look at that, especially when you're trying to innovate, that you can create this kind of emotional safety for people to trust one another?
Yeah, Stephen Covey does a great job of talking about this. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but I think his book, The Speed of Trust, was published in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And he described trust as being a function of both character and competence. So I don't know, Susan, have you ever studied the ancient samurai?
I can't say that I have.
So
I watched The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, but that's about it. And I don't really count that in the category of real literature. So,
when I was in grad school, all the courses were I could choose any course and it was free. So every semester I would choose a recreational course. And one year I took épée de guerre, sword fighting.
hmm
And the instructor of that said that the ancient samurai had this ethos that their word was to be trusted. So if an ancient samurai told you that he would be at a certain time and place and then didn't show up, that you could be certain he was dead. That's character, right? That's character. And I want people to expect that of me, and I want them to expect that of themselves. I'm a 21st century American, and you can take me at my word.
that in its own right, right? We feel a lot of politicians that we're watching are pretty slippery individuals whose words change on the regular, and there's an endless amount of backpedaling around ideas.
Yeah. Well, that also factors into authenticity. We need to expect authenticity of our leaders and of ourselves.
We should
Well,
have, and we should hold them to account as well.
yeah, 100%. I mean, this democracy only functions if all three branches of government fulfill their constitutional duties.
Right.
Accountability, checks and balances, it doesn't function without that.
hmm And part of it is like we all believe we're playing by the same rules, right? There's this belief that that's what we're doing here, right? I mean, that all of us are, we follow the same. It's like playing a board game, and we're all following the rules as they've been laid out. We can't just call wild card in the middle of it and say, "Yeah, we're not following that particular rule today."
Yeah, you're right. And
Mhm,
that's a strategic mistake.
mhm.
That's we need to fix that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, devil's advocate, is it a strategic mistake, or is it the classic disruptor who says, I'm not willing to abide by that rule because I don't believe that rule serves the interests and values of the country or the direction that I wanted to go in?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I guess we're speaking a little bit past each other. Yeah, if you fundamentally disagree with something, you should absolutely not do it. Like I'm not trying to say that we should blindly follow things.
Mm.
I'm just trying to say that we need to be authentic.
Right. No, I'm talking about those who are actively disrupting now. They've decided to turn over the table and say, I don't like these rules.
Yeah. No, no, no. I totally agree with that. Like I don't disagree in any way with what you just said. What I'm saying is we should expect that of everybody around us and our politicians. That should be the expectation that we're all playing by rules that we all agree with.
Yeah. And that there are methods to actually go about changing the rules in the event that the rules don't
Yes. Yeah.
fit our
Like
structure anymore, right?
like a constitutional amendment. Yeah, 100%. There are mechanisms for that. Yeah, yeah. That's necessary. I fully support that.
Yeah, but that's
But
not what's happening at the moment.
we need societally to be more rooted in trust. Right. And the other component of trust, as Stephen Covey pointed out, is competence. So
Mhm.
do you trust me to administer a United States submarine? I, I don't know, probably not. I hope so. My people, it seems they did when I was in that job, right? But did they trust me to rebuild a pump? They should not have, because I cannot rebuild a pump. I would be incompetent at that task because I don't have the skills or the requisite background to rebuild a pump, right? So competence is another thing that must be considered when you're assigning trust to somebody. So if you're assigning them a task, you need to consider the complexity of that task and who's the right person from a responsibility standpoint, as well as from a character and competence standpoint, and make sure that you assign it to the right person.
Mhm. So that trust building is a day-to-day thing, right? That is not a one and done thing.
Yeah, it's a day-to-day thing. You build it up over time and you can lose it in an instant.
Yeah. And so, can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, you're talking to a lot of innovation leaders in the audience today who are leading teams, who are breaking rules, who are creating new products and services and really thinking outside the box. What is the key to creating that psychological safety when you're on a nuclear submarine? I heard you say, I take those recommendations and those thoughts from my team seriously, and I listen for what's there and what's not. What else should leaders be thinking about when working in these high stakes environments?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, day to day on an operational submarine during peacetime, it's not the place for bold innovations. We're more focused on how do we understand the requirements and how do we safely execute those as a team. There's about 150 people on a submarine, and you can make the argument that they're the most complex machines in the world. So a lot has to be learned about just following the rules. That said, if I'm ever given the privilege of commanding a nuclear powered submarine and I'm put in a situation where we are at war, you can bet your bottom dollar that I will engage in innovative warfare. Innovation in warfare is so widespread throughout history that you have to consider it integral to the human condition. If we didn't innovate in warfare, we would be fighting with sticks and stones against an enemy who innovated, and we would quickly lose, and then we would be ruled by those who choose to innovate.
Mm.
Radical innovation is necessary in the military and in business.
Yeah. And that trust is critical in order to allow people to bring their brilliant ideas to the fore and feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Those kind of sweeping changes, right? Or these breakthrough ideas to the fore.
Yeah. That's where you need good quality leadership. And I've been in the military for 25 years, and I've seen some very good ones. I've seen some greats, and I've seen some bad ones.
So give me a juxtaposition between a good leader and a bad leader. Like, what are those, if you had the list side by side, what do you think of those characteristics that really put a great leader over the top?
All right, I'll start with the bad leaders, and I don't want to dwell on them too much,
Mm-hmm.
but they're people who fundamentally don't trust those under them. They insist on being the ones who make all the decisions. They tend to be more authoritarian. Like, think about somebody who insists on making all the decisions. How can anybody come up with any kind of idea and present that to that person? Because that idea is very likely to just be quashed by the leader and thrown in the trash or kicked back angrily, right? Which only frustrates the person who is trying to do a good thing. Is it any wonder in a situation like that that the person who's trying to do a good thing loses morale and that organizations don't function as well as a result? The leader has to trust their people. And here's a fundamental point that I learned from Alfie Kohn in the book that I mentioned earlier, Punished by Rewards, is that a person will perceive their own competence based on whether or not they get to choose or assess their own standard. So think about that for a second. If I give you a task which has a high likelihood of me just ripping it apart, then you are likely to perceive your own incompetence. But if I give you a task, maybe it's the same task, and you get to decide your standard of excellence, you will perceive your own competence.
And so the ramifications for the perception of your own competence is shallow, right? It's like it's inaccurate in thinking about yourself.
Well, I'm thinking about it more from a leader's perspective. Leaders should want to and actively do instill a feeling of competence in their subordinates. I want my people to feel competent. I read something on LinkedIn the other day, and some guy responded to this good post on leadership coaching, and he said something like, well, nobody's going to get that anyway because I'm totally surrounded by incompetent people. And I'm like, how
Wow.
can you be surrounded by incompetent people? That doesn't exist in the society unless you're the fault. But
Right.
you need to look inward, and if you can't fix it, you need to resign. But that's an example of an organization that is in dire need of higher quality executive leadership.
Right. That because it also pretends that that person that doesn't will refuse to take responsibility for the performance of his team at some point, right? He'll determine that, well, I already told you that my own people were incompetent, therefore not my problem.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. And that is not the kind of individual that you want leading, who doesn't have the buck stops here mentality.
Yep. It's an example of a person who got promoted too high. And you can tell it in a one sentence post on LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
You
Yeah,
know,
you must feel
Marshall,
that like your spidey senses go up, Miles. Is that what happens when you see it on LinkedIn?
yeah, I mean, Dr. Marshall Goldsmith wrote a very good book titled "What Got You Here Won't Get You Here," and
Won't get you there.
it
Yeah.
almost says everything in the title right there. Like,
Mhm.
if you do so well at your job that you get promoted to the next job, you need to learn those new skills. You cannot just keep executing the ones that made you successful up to that point. And if you don't, you're going to fail.
Amen. That's right. Yeah, and I think good leaders, and especially even athletes, they visualize themselves performing at a higher rate than what they currently do. They visualize themselves hitting all the three-pointers, right? Getting all the dunks, hitting all the baskets.
Yeah.
And then when it comes time to actually perform, they have a mental picture of what's already possible and they train
Yes.
toward that end.
Yes.
Whereas a lot of leaders are consistently resting on their laurels and thinking, well, I know I did that already, therefore I'll be able to do X without doing any of the work to step up. And that's lessons in character just as much as it is skill sets.
Yep. Yep. Totally agree. And I
Yeah.
do the same thing that athletes do. And I hope you do also.
Mhm.
When I do, it's on a daily basis. I picture in my mind how I will pursue excellence. And then I go do that and I define excellence myself. Nobody else defines my excellence.
Right. And so I do the same thing before every keynote, before every workshop, asking myself, how can I make it better than the last one? How can I serve these people in a way that I haven't before? What new magic or excitement can I bring? So much of leadership, of great leadership and communicating with teams is around storytelling. And I'm so curious, Miles, what that looks like inside of the military, especially inside the Marine Corps, inside the Navy. What does it look like to share stories around leadership, uh, and get other people motivated to find that intrinsic motivation for themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I bet my answer is probably going to surprise you a little bit, the direction I take it. But the military prepares for war, right? And we have throughout peacetime, we have to psychologically and mentally and physically prepare for that, right? And that's as true in the Navy as it is in all the other branches. You have to prepare for it, right? And part of what we do is we tell stories about great examples of military leadership and military innovation in the past. So I would like to share the story of Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, if I may.
Okay.
So on a cold, foggy morning, Valentine's Day in 1797, during the Napoleonic Wars, the British fleet sought to cut off the Spanish fleet from uniting with the French.
Okay.
Okay, so far?
Yeah.
Now, the British fleet was disciplined. They recognized the very real strategic threat to their way of life. The Spanish fleet outnumbered the British by double, but they weren't disciplined. They were spread out in two kind of scattered formations or two divisions, if you will. And they weren't even trying for a battle. Even though they doubled the number of British ships, they were just trying to get past them so they could go up north and unite with the French and ultimately come at Britain and attack their way of life. Well, the commander of the British fleet was a guy named Admiral Jervis, and he had a problem with that. And so did Horatio Nelson, and so did the British government, right? Character of the people, character of the government, character of the military, all this factored into the buildup to the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. So it's a cold, foggy morning. Admiral Jervis leads his ship. I think it was 14 capital ships, and he was trying to cut the Spanish fleet in two. So he kind of shot the gap between the two. And as the fog lifted, everybody recognized that they overshot. They were past the Spanish fleet. And bear in mind, this is in the day of sail, right? So it's not so easy. You don't just shift the rudder and turn around, right? You got to negotiate the winds and everything like that. And Admiral Nelson was in the third ship from the rear, and he saw this play out. And he took on his own accord to violate the order of his commander to hold the line. He executed a nearly 270-degree turn to port.
Is that hard?
Not necessarily, it's just drastic, right?
Mhm.
He broke off from the line and made a
Mhm.
large turn to the left and headed straight for the lead ship in that Spanish division. Right? Can you imagine the daring in that? It's a cold morning, right? Think he has a whole ship of people. His fleet is outnumbered by a factor of two, and he chooses to break off from them and head directly at the lead ship, right? And in the ensuing minutes, his ship, Nelson's, is incapacitated, no longer able to function, and Nelson himself leads the charge on the boarding party of that Spanish ship and forces its surrender. And then another Spanish ship came up to that first Spanish ship's aid, and Nelson and his team boarded that second one and forced their surrender. This was innovative warfare to a remarkable degree. Like, can you even fathom the daring that's involved in doing something like that? Had he failed, he would have been court-martialed at best, if not executed by his own people. And that's not even to mention the like immediate threat of dying in battle. And he chose to defend his nation on such a level that he did something that daring. And without that, Trafalgar is not possible. Nelson crossed the T at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, and as a result, Americans and Britons and many others throughout the world still experience the positive wealth benefits from that. And English is a more widespread language throughout the world as a direct consequence of that battle.
Mhm.
Innovative warfare.
And so you attribute that to taking risks, breaking the ranks, and going rogue?
I don't, I would not use the term rogue. I would definitely agree with taking risks. You have to be willing to take risks. And sometimes you have to be willing to take big risks. Right. And there's a difference between boldness and rashness. And sometimes that can only be
You
defined.
don't really know that until the other side, right? This could have gone horribly wrong, in
Exactly.
which case we would be having a conversation about being rash.
That's 100% correct. Sometimes
Yeah.
you don't know until the result plays out, right? And that's what makes it risky. If it weren't that way, then it wouldn't even be risky.
Mm,
You have to be willing to take risks. And
yeah.
the government, by the way, I'm reading this excellent book. If anybody has not read this book and you're interested in the public versus the private sector, there's this book by Mariana Mazzucato called The Entrepreneurial State, which talks about a lot of this stuff. And she argues quite convincingly that the government needs to be much more risk taking than businesses. And without that risk taking, we wouldn't have the things like the internet and touchscreen technology and GPS. It has to be strategically focused and look so far into the future and be willing to take risks, which necessarily entails a lot of failures along with those successes so that our entire economy can benefit.
Yeah. Well, Miles, this has been such a fantastic conversation, and we didn't even get to talk about your and my favorite new movie, The Brutalist, because we're big cinema heads as well. But maybe we'll save that for another discussion. But if you haven't seen it yet, go and see The Brutalist for folks who are willing to take risks and do things that a lot of us are not willing to do. So I'm going to ask you the three questions I ask every guest on the show. The first is, what is the greatest invention of all time?
Okay, all time, I'm going to have to narrow that down a little bit to all of human history.
Yes.
Uh,
I
and
don't know that elephants are inventing a lot. So
well, I mean, you could argue that the coral reef is an invention. I
oh,
mean,
I
it's
don't
up
want
for
to talk
debate.
about who's inventing that.
Yeah, fair. Okay, fair enough. All right. Yeah, language matters.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say I have four answers, but I'll give them to you in order.
Okay.
Number one, the wheel.
Uh,
Number two, the plow. Number three, the printing press. And number four, the interneted computer.
okay. I like how you jam those two things together. Way to go. It's like the Reese's peanut butter cup is far better than the chocolate or the peanut butter on its own. Let's see. If you could join any innovation team in history, which would you have joined?
If I had my pick, I would choose Horatio Nelson's team at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. And if you want a more modern example, I would choose.
Wait, is the innovation team? I mean, typically most of my guests think about joining a team that built a thing, but you're talking about joining a team that did a thing. So what is the innovation? Is the innovation just chutzpah, just moxie to go out and do it? What's the innovation?
That would be a longer conversation on military tactics, military operations, and military strategy.
So they
But
innovated military tactics in order to make that happen.
yes, that was innovative warfare on a historic scale. And
Gotcha.
if you want a more modern example, I would choose NASA from 1961 to 1969.
Yeah,
Organizational excellence on a historic scale.
absolutely.
I would love to be part of that team.
Yeah, you are not alone in that choice. And what's something you wish would be innovated that hasn't been, something that pisses you off or would make all of us so happy?
Okay. Can I cheat and give you a few answers?
No, you can give me one answer.
Oh, all right. Let me look at my list then.
The innovator's dilemma is choosing one direction to go forward, right? I mean,
All right.
you have to choose
All right.
one.
That's fair. All right. I'll play by the rules. All right. Which
I
one?
gave you 4 for the greatest innovation of all time. 4. Great test is a
All right.
superlative. 1. So choose one.
All right. That's fair. I would
Mhm.
like an innovation that enables and incentivizes the US government to foster capitalistic behavior in government contracted organizations.
Yes. I think everyone in my listening audience would agree with you. Hands down.
Well, I'm telling you, this book by Mariana Mazzucato addresses some of the issues in that and
Fantastic.
has some thoughts on how to do it.
Great. And if some of my fellow military members are listening, we need better storytelling in order to put some of these brilliant ideas to work and to get circulating through the organization, all of your brilliant innovations in the military so that other people can take up the mantle of innovation inside the military to make that happen. So if you are innovating inside of the military or you work for large corporations that are supporting the military, keep the stories going of the brilliant work that you do in order to inspire other leaders and other teams to keep doing more of that.
100%.
So, Miles, if people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm also on Medium at Mag98. And my website is on executiveleadership.com.
Fantastic. Miles, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks.